Thank you all. Thank you so much. I know this is the last talk on the last day, so we were saying we're going to drag everyone across the line and talk about something that's very related to open and open source software, but open source hardware. So like a little twist for the end of the day. I'm Michael Weinberg. I'm wearing kind of two hats today for this presentation. One is I'm with a research organization called the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at New York University Law School, although I'm actually based here in Berlin. And I'm also a longtime board member of OSHWA, the Open Source Hardware Association. And so those two things kind of come together in the world of open hardware certification. So quickly, the Engelberg Center, the reason that is relevant for this conversation is that we're a research center at a law school in the US, and so we do a lot of research on how open hardware works and how it kind of works in practice, in law, in policy. And so if you are someone who thinks about open hardware or open software in those contexts, these are some reports that we've done. We're kind of talking about it all the time, and so I'm happy to chat about that later. The probably more important part of this is my role at OSHWA, the Open Source Hardware Association. I don't know, are people like familiar-ish with OSHWA? Give you a good introduction. This is good. This is a good opportunity. So OSHWA is the community organization for open source hardware. It is what it sounds like it is. And OSHWA has been around for almost 15 years now, and we do a whole collection of things. So one thing that we do is the Open Hardware Summit every year. I'm going to talk about that again at the end, but the Open Hardware Summit this year is actually here in Berlin in May. And so if you are kind of excited about open hardware, that might be worth checking out. We also are the home to the open hardware definition. This is the community definition of open hardware. It will feel very familiar for those of you who are familiar with the open software definition just ported to hardware. We run the open source hardware certification program that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more today. We also do a regular kind of community show and tell to see what's going on in the world of open hardware. We run Open Hardware Month, which is in October, which is a great time to kind of get engaged and get connected to open hardware. And then we also have this new initiative called Open Healthware, which is specifically for open hardware that's tied to the medical and health community. So obviously, the theme running through this is open and hardware. All these things are open hardware related, and this is sort of what OSHWA is all about, right? It's a role in the community to engage with open source hardware. So this talk is all about the certification program, and I'm going to talk about what we've learned. But before I talk about what we've learned, I want to explain why we did this in the first place and what decisions we made along the way. Because there's a lot of decisions about kind of community management that I think is relevant in other spaces. So when we were thinking about putting together this certification program, we had kind of four main problems we were trying to address. And these are problems in a specific context. They aren't necessarily problems in like the larger concept of openness, but they were problems for us. One is no one owns the term open source hardware. And so on one hand, that's great, right? Anybody can say this is open source hardware, but you can also create problems where people have mismatched expectations. And relatedly, there's an Open Gear logo that OSHWA actually is the steward of, but OSHWA and no one controls the Open Gear logo. And so similarly, anyone can use it, no matter what their relationship is to open hardware. And the result of this is there's a kind of a good faith version of this problem and a bad faith version of this problem. The good faith version is there were people who were creating what they thought of as open hardware and releasing it to the community under their expectations of open hardware. And then community members were seeing it, were trying to use it, were trying to build on it, and the community members' expectation of open hardware was different. Right? So there's a misalignment. There's also a bad faith version of this problem. I actually just came from a talk on open washing. And so as you can imagine, there were lots of people running around and continue to be lots of people running around saying, this is open source hardware, just don't ask me for any of the schematics. Like, don't ask, it's not really that, well, you know, we'll after our successful Kickstarter, we're gonna be excited to release all of the stuff. And so there was just a problem where there were people who were saying this is open hardware and talking about open hardware in a way that was disrupting expectations in the community. There was a related problem around inconsistent gatekeeping. And this is not a kind of new problem for online communities, not a new problem for open source communities, where we had people and we had companies who said, I want to do open hardware, but it's complicated. And my concern is that if I mistakenly mess something up, even if it's in good faith, the community is just going to come after me and I'd rather just stay away. And so that was keeping people out of the community. And this was a problem. So we had these sort of no shared expectation, with this expectation mismatch, and we had this inconsistent gatekeeping that we were trying to resolve. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, well, one thing that we do have as OSHWA is this definition, right? Is this open hardware definition that the community helped develop, that the community stands behind. So it's a single point of reference that kind of a majority of people in the community feel comfortable with. And so what if we use that definition to build out a certification program? And the certification program will use a new logo that OSHWA controls and issue some information that is within OSHWA's space. And so what that allowed us to do is to say, okay, we have a shared definition, so it makes it easy to understand what this version of open hardware is. OSHWA controls OSHWA controls the use of it. And so if someone is trying to use it in a way that breaks the rules, something can happen. Also, if you're a new entrant to the community and you go through the certification program and someone from the community starts saying, oh, you're doing it wrong or there's a problem, OSHWA can be your ally and say, at a minimum, they went through this process in good faith and we're going to help resolve the issue. And then the final piece was, a certification program only matters as much as anyone cares about it. And so the downside risk was pretty low. Like if it turns out this wasn't a good idea and no one cared about it, like who cares? We'll all just walk away and pretend it never happened. So we moved forward. We did it was actually about a year-long consultation process with the community. We had a lot of questions we asked about the shape and the size, and there were some really core design decisions that we made in rolling it out. One, that it was free. So we talked about different fee structures, we talked about different ways to be able to structure it, and we ultimately decided it's better if it's free, anyone can do it, anyone can jump in. We're not going to worry about paying to be able to use the certification program. The second one was that there were no tiers. So, many of us are familiar with kind of LEED certified or other certification programs where it's silver, platinum, super platinum, triple diamond, whatever it is. And you can think about a lot of different, what parts of open hardware would be open to match those tiers. But ultimately, we decided that was just too complicated, both to administer and from a messaging standpoint. So we wanted people to know, what does it mean when they see the open hardware logo? We also knew that it needed to be lightweight to run. OSHWA is a mostly volunteer-driven organization. We have some staff, but we're a small organization that kind of punches above our weight. And we knew if this required a giant infrastructure with a bunch of permanent employees, it might not work. Especially C, it's free, right? And so finally, we decided not to implement expert review. And this is something that's very specific. Each application is reviewed by someone who's an expert in open source hardware, but not a subject area specialist. Because open hardware is incredibly vast. There are microcontrollers that are open hardware, there are robots that are open hardware, there's camping gear that's open hardware, there's knitwear that's open hardware, there's perfume that's open hardware. And so to have subject area experts on call for every single one of those areas wasn't going to be sustainable. We have another way to deal with it, but we decided that would make it the opposite of lightweight to run. And so if you're thinking right now, okay, this more or less makes sense, but hardware is different than software because there's a lot of components in hardware that aren't necessarily open source and don't necessarily come from someone who creates there aren't open source alternatives. So what does it mean to be open, and how do you handle that problem? And this was something that was a big part of the community discussion. And ultimately, we decided on this idea of the user contribution. So the idea of the user contribution is, if you are creating hardware, the things that you do have to be open. You created them. You have the legal ability to openly license them, to make the documentation available. You have to do that. For everything else that is outside of your control, right? You can't go and force somebody to open source a microcontroller or an LED or whatever else it is. You have to document it well enough that someone else can find it, and it has to be generally available, which in practice means you have to be able to access it without signing an NDA. And so this user contribution allowed us to kind of allow open hardware to work in the real world, right? The contribution, the design that you do, you have to open source, but we live in the real world with closed components, and so as long as those are documented and available, that's totally fine. So how does this program work? It's pretty straightforward. There is an application. It takes less than 5 minutes, hopefully, to fill out on the OSHWA site. So you fill out information about, where is your documentation, what licenses do you use, who are you, how do we contact you, things like that. It goes into a review queue. If everything is fine, then it just moves right through the review queue. But very often, there are questions that the review team will have, and they'll email back and forth with the creator to get things straightened out. And this has turned out to have a really great side effect of being a good entry point for people into the community. Because if you're new to open hardware and you submit your certification, you might get an email from someone on the team that says, hey, this project looks great, but you're missing this kind of documentation. Or like, you're missing a license, or you're missing this thing. And it allows you to kind of meet the community expectations without having to kind of do it in public and maybe get someone yelling at you on the internet. Once you move through the process, then you get issued a license to use this certification logo, and you get a unique identifier for your hardware. And that unique identifier can be used in the directory that houses all of the open hardware to be able to find it. And so if you're holding open hardware that's certified in your hand, very often there will be the unique identifier there, which points to the directory. The directory is not a repository. We don't say you have to use this platform to do your documentation. We don't hold all your documentation. It's just pointers to where the documentation is. So again, lightweight to run, easy to use. So that's how the system works. We're finally getting to the point of this talk, like what have we learned about doing it for now a decade? The first thing we've learned is open source hardware really is everywhere. At this point, this screenshot is actually from the website from yesterday, so this is a pretty accurate number. We have over 3,000 pieces of certified open source hardware from over 60 countries on every continent except Antarctica. And I always mention that when I'm talking about open source hardware, because someday, someone in the audience is going to be like, I know somebody in Antarctica that is making open source hardware, and so then we can get that certified, and I could knock that talking point off. So if you know somebody, come find me. I'd love to chat, help them do it. And you can also track this on the OSHWA website. So this is great. It's an easy way to see. And if you're wondering, if you're new to open source hardware and trying to understand what open source hardware is and what are examples, this creates a great entry point for you because you can explore what's happening in it. On the map, if you want to go by country, but also the directory has all sorts of information about all sorts of different types of open source hardware. And open hardware really is an incredibly broad category. I think when open hardware started, a lot of people were thinking, PCBs, 3D printers, kind of electronics. There are a lot of electronics in open source hardware. There's a lot of many other things, right? We've got jewelry. We've got people who are doing knitting. I mentioned perfume, camping equipment, musical equipment, all sorts of environmental sensors that people are doing for research, lab equipment, exercise things. Basically, if it is physical, if it's made of atoms, and it is open source hardware. Another thing that we've learned is this system that we built to not have to have experts has worked really well. So the way this system is intended to work is, as I mentioned, you submit your application, it gets reviewed by someone who is an open source hardware expert, but isn't necessarily a subject area expert. They get it all sorted out, you get certified, you go in the directory, it goes out in the world. If someone is trying to use your documentation to actually modify, build upon, use your hardware, who's an expert in the space, and finds a problem, they reach out to OSHWA and says, hey, I'm trying to use this documentation for this piece of hardware. I think there's a problem. At that point, OSHWA will bring in an expert to ask them to take a look. If the expert agrees that it might be a problem, we reach out to the creator and we say, hey, someone's trying to use your hardware. That's great. They've raised this concern. What do you think? And sometimes the creator will say, you're right, it's missing this thing. I've updated the repo. Everything is cool. Sometimes the creator will say, I think you're wrong. I think actually it doesn't need this. And we'll actually mediate the conversation to make it a kind of a civil conversation and decide sometimes the creator is right, sometimes the user is right, but we actually investigate it and do it in a way that people feel like they have been heard and that we've gone through a process. And sometimes people just say, you're right, it's not enough, and I'm gonna withdraw. I don't want to be involved in this, which is also fine, right? Which is great. So this has worked as a civil dispute resolution process, as opposed to other internet-based methods of resolving conflict, which have a variable track record I think we're all familiar with. It has definitely resulted in improved documentation because it's a mechanism for user feedback. And we also have revoked certification, which I think is a good thing. I mean, it's sort of bad in the moment, but the fact that we revoke certification it happens once every year or 18 months, that means that when you see the certification logo, it means something, right? It means that it's real, because if it wasn't real, then it may have been revoked. Something that people talk about a lot is this idea of I'm going to build a GitHub for hardware, right? Because GitHub has its strengths and weaknesses, not optimized for hardware. One thing that we have learned is at this point, GitHub is the GitHub for hardware. There's a really long tail of where people put documentation. So I don't want to suggest that everything is on GitHub. But when you look, GitHub is where things are clustering. And that's not a surprise, right? A lot of people are comfortable in that space. It's a way to easily and post your stuff publicly. So even GitHub may not even be your primary kind of working space, but it's a primary sharing space. So that's kind of where we are right now. But people do all sorts of things to share their documentation. We had this idea when we started the program that one of the benefits of it would be to kind of offload the evaluation of open hardware. And this kind of works, you can imagine this this works with software licenses too, right? If you want to know if some software is open source, you ask yourself kind of two questions, right? Can I find the source? And does it use a license that I think is open? And then you can kind of stop looking. And hardware openness is a little bit more complicated. You have to look a little bit deeper. The legal parts are a little bit more complicated. The documentation parts are a little bit more complicated. But if you see the certification logo, you can say, great, I'm just going to assume that it's open, and I'm going to do something else. I'm going to focus on a different part that I care about. And this has worked okay. There's a journal, academic journal, Hardware X, that is focused on open source hardware. And they say, if you come to us with certified hardware, we're just going to assume that it's open and kind of move on with our review. Similarly, we're working in deep collaboration with the DINSpec folks here in Germany, who are doing a much more intensive level of review. And one thing that we're collaborating with them about is kind of offloading the easy initial review to the OSHWA certification program so they can focus on their much more in-depth review. And then the last thing is this open healthware program that I mentioned at the top. But this is a new area for OSHWA where we're really focused on medical supplies, medical devices. And that is a much more intensive subject area specific review. And one of the things that we're looking at building that for is to say, look, step one is to do the is it open hardware review. And that's what the certification program does. And then step two is it open healthware? Does it have the additional documentation? Does it have the additional testing? Have all the additional things that we need for open healthware? And it allows you to kind of separate those two analyses and separate the teams. So that's working kind of like reasonably well at this point. We do have citations built into the directory, and people do use those. They don't use them as much as we thought when we built it, but people will say, oh, this is my hardware, and maybe this is version 3 of something that I built, and here's version 1 and version 2. Or they will say, this is my hardware, and it's building off of these other pieces of hardware, some certified, some not. And so you can use that information to kind of build a little bit of a web and an evolutionary tree of open hardware. A couple years ago, we built this API that I think is great. It's a read-write API. So if you want to build applying for certification into your workflow, you can do that and submit your application automatically. And we do see some people who are doing that, especially companies who kind of certify at scale. It allows them to sort of submit as part of their workflow. It's been really effective. There's also a read API where people can explore all the certification directory and kind of see what's been done. People use it a little bit. And usually when I'm talking about it, I'm kind of like, the API is good, but it's not lighting the world on fire. But I will say that I actually had a conversation yesterday with somebody with a platform that is interested in using the API to kind of integrate their platform more directly with the certification program. If that turns out to work, then I will say the API is a roaring success, and I will have to like change this. I will stop talking about it being not that popular. But even if it, however it's used for the application side, we have found it to be super useful on the data analytics side, because it really does allow you to just pull down information about all 3,000 plus pieces of certified hardware and do all sorts of digging. And so we've started kind of poking around and publishing. I think we published a kind of an initial review at the end of last year. We'll probably do a new kind of deeper dive into the data for Open Hardware Month in October. But the API just makes that really possible and really straightforward to do. And then I will also say, one thing that we have learned, this has nothing to do with hardware, but like static site architecture is amazing. One of the key goals was to make it lightweight to run. So we built this certification. This is actually version 2 of the certification infrastructure. We built that in 2018 and have basically spent $0 on maintaining it since. And it just like works. It's so beautiful to have a piece of software that you can kind of build once, people use all the time, and it just kind of runs. So big endorsement for static sites as a structure. We love it. We use it for everything now. And you can see then also, I mentioned the directory, right? Like this is the information that's in the directory. You can do all sorts of filtering by country, by product type, by license. You can do kind of plain text search. And so it's a real way to kind of explore what's going on. So I'm running out of time, so I will say first, maybe it's time, if you're here, to think about certifying. It is free, it is fast, certification.oshwa.org. In addition to the directory and the certification process, there's a lot of documentation about how to do documentation, how to think about licensing. There are lots of examples of hardware that do that. So if you want to learn more about open hardware and kind of as a practice, the site's a great place to do that. And then I will also mention, as I said at the top, Open Hardware Summit is coming to Berlin in just a few months. It's here at the 23rd and 24th of May. And so if you have not started looking at the Open Hardware Summit, this is a really good opportunity to check it out, 2026.oshwa.org. It's like an amazing 2 days of people who are just doing all open hardware. You've got people who are doing it in academia. You've got artists. You've got people who are doing it in industry, just like the whole space of open hardware. There's usually someone talking about putting collars on elephants to track them through the wild, or counting how many moths are in the jungle. There's just like all sorts of crazy stuff that is happening at the Open Hardware Summit. So that's it. I've got maybe a minute or two for questions if people have questions, but I will say thank you all so much for coming to this last talk on the last day. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael Weinberg. Thank you.